The satellite photos arrived in my inbox 3 days ago. At first, I thought they were spam, just another piece of junk mail to delete. But the subject line caught my eye. Archaeological survey, Kuwait, Iraq border region. My hands trembled as I opened the attachment, and there they were. The same distinctive formations, the same strange geometric patterns in the sand that had haunted my dreams for the past 30 years. I'm breaking my silence now because I have to, because what we encountered in 1991 isn't dead, and it isn't sleeping anymore. I can tell from these images that they're planning to build there, right on top of that godforsaken place. I can't let that happen, not without warning them, not without telling the truth about what lies beneath those sands. My name is James Harrison, though everyone in my unit called me Jack. I served in the Royal Marines for 15 years, including deployment during the Gulf War. I've earned medals I'm proud of, and others I keep locked away because I can't bear to look at them. They remind me too much of what we lost out there. Of the 12 men in my squad who were deployed to that sector, only 3 of us are still alive today. That's not a coincidence. What happened out there in the desert wasn't just war, it was something else, something older than war itself. Before I begin this story properly, you need to understand something. I'm not crazy. I've spent years in therapy working through PTSD like many veterans. I know the difference between trauma responses and real memories. What I'm about to tell you isn't some stress-induced hallucination or desert fever dream. I wish it was. God, how I wish it was. It started in January 1991. The air was crisp with winter chill when we first touched down in Saudi Arabia. People think the desert is always hot, but they forget how cold it gets at night, how the temperature can plummet and leave you shivering in your boots. We were part of the coalition forces, tasked with special reconnaissance missions along the Kuwait-Iraq border. Standard stuff, or so we thought. Our squad was a tight-knit group, the kind you only get after months of training together. Lieutenant William Morrison, billed to his friends, led us. He'd transferred from the SAS, though he never talked about his time there. Built like a boxer with hands like sledgehammers, but he had this way of thinking 3 steps ahead that kept us alive more times than I can count, at least until the end. Derek Thompson was our combat medic, a Glaswegian with a sense of humor darker than a moonless night. He could stitch a wound and tell a joke simultaneously, keeping morale up even when things went sideways. Michael O'Brien handled communications, a wizard with radio equipment and the only man I've ever met who could pick up a signal in the middle of a sandstorm. Then there was Bobby Jenkins, our youngest. 20 years old and already the best sniper I'd ever seen. He had this innocent look about him, like he should have been in university instead of a war zone. Sometimes I still hear his laugh in my dreams before they turn into nightmares. That first week was textbook operations. We patrolled our assigned sector, mapped enemy positions, and gathered intel. The Iraqi forces were dug in deep, but we'd expected that. What we hadn't expected was the equipment failures. It started with the radios. O'Brien noticed it first. Strange interference patterns, signals that didn't match any known military or civilian frequencies. At first, we assumed it was Iraqi attempts at jamming our communications. But then other things started malfunctioning. Compass needles spinning wildly, night vision goggles flickering for no reason. Even our watches began losing time. Morrison reported it up the chain of command, but with the build-up to the ground war in full swing, minor equipment issues weren't exactly a priority. We adapted, using older backup gear when possible, and working around the malfunctions. Looking back, we should have recognized these as warnings, the canary in the coal mine going silent. The first real sign that something was wrong came when we found the animals. A cluster of desert foxes, dead without a mark on them, arranged in a perfect circle as if placed there deliberately. Their eyes were open, and all of them were facing the same direction, northeast, toward a series of low hills that weren't marked on any of our maps. Thompson did a field examination and couldn't determine a cause of death. No wounds, no signs of dehydration or disease. They looked like they'd simply stopped living, all at the same moment. We took photographs and samples following protocol, but the samples were lost in transit, and the photographs developed completely black. The locals we encountered, Bedouin traders and displaced civilians, refused to go near those hills. When our translator tried to ask them why, they would turn away, making signs against evil. One old man grabbed my arm and said something that our translator refused to repeat. It wasn't until years later that I learned what those words meant. The ancient ones are hungry again. We documented everything meticulously, as we were trained to do. O'Brien kept a personal journal as well, encrypted in a code he'd developed himself. He was always paranoid about operational security, but this went beyond that. There are some things the brass doesn't need to know, he told me one night on watch, and some things they shouldn't know. A week later, he was dead. The dreams started around this time. At first, they were subtle, just feelings of being watched, of shadows moving against the desert wind. But they grew more vivid, more specific. Every night, I would see the same scene, a door opening in the sand, steps leading down into darkness, and something vast stirring in the depths below. I never told anyone, but I noticed the dark circles under my squad mates' eyes, the way they would jerk awake from their own dreams, gasping and reaching for their weapons. Morrison pushed us harder than ever during this period, running drills and keeping us focused on our mission, but even he couldn't hide his concern. I caught him studying ancient maps of the region, comparing them with our modern satellite imagery. When I asked him what he was looking for, he just shook his head. "Hoping I'm wrong, Jack," he said, "praying I'm wrong." We weren't supposed to be in that sector when everything went wrong. Our orders were to pull back, to regroup with the main force preparing for the ground offensive. But then we picked up the distress signal, and everything changed. It was weak, barely readable through the static, but we could make out enough. A coalition forward observation post calling for immediate assistance. Morrison tried to get clarification from command, but our long-range communications were completely down. Standard protocol said we should report and wait for orders. Morrison took one look at his map, then at our squad, and made the call. "We're not leaving our people out there to die." We moved out at dusk, using the growing darkness for cover. The coordinates from the distress signal led us northeast, toward those unmapped hills that had been haunting my dreams. As we approached, the malfunctions got worse. Our night vision goggles stopped working entirely. Rifle-mounted torches flickered and died. Even the luminous dials on our watches went dark, as if the very concept of light was being drained from the world around us. That's when we heard it. A sound that had no place in the desert, no place in the natural world at all. Like metal being twisted until it screams, like the earth itself crying out in pain. And underneath it all, almost too low to hear but impossible to ignore, was a rhythm that made your teeth ache and your bones vibrate in sympathy. Morrison raised his fist, and we froze in our tracks. In the dying light, I could see his face, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw fear in his eyes. He opened his mouth to give an order, but before he could speak, the screaming started. I should stop here and clarify something. I've heard men scream before, in training, in combat, in hospitals. I know what human screams sound like. What we heard that night wasn't human. It couldn't have been human, but it spoke words. English words, Arabic words, words in languages I'd never heard before and hoped to never hear again. The rest of that night, I need a moment before I continue that part of the story. Even now, 30 years later, I have to steady my hands before I can write about what happened next. Because what we found at that observation post changed everything we thought we knew about our world, about history, about what's really out there in the dark spaces of our maps. And the worst part is knowing that it's still out there, still hungry, still waiting. The observation post stood on a slight rise, barely visible against the darkening sky. As we approached, Bobby signaled us to stop, peering through his rifle scope. "Movement," he whispered. "Northwest corner, second floor." Morrison split us into two teams. I went with him, Thompson, and Jenkins, while O'Brien led the second team to circle around back. The sand shifted unnaturally under our boots, not like normal desert terrain. It felt almost crystallized, crunching with each step despite our careful movement. The first thing we noticed was the smell, not decomposition or blood, but something chemical like ozone after a lightning strike mixed with burning plastic. Thompson pulled his collar over his nose, eyes watering. "That's not right," he muttered. "That's not bloody right at all." The observation post's main door hung open, swinging gently despite the lack of wind. Our torchlight revealed boot prints in the sand, some leading in, none coming out. The prints themselves were distorted, as if the people making them had been running, dragging themselves, their gaits damaged or altered. Inside, the post looked wrong, not just ransacked or attacked, wrong. The walls bore marks I still struggled to describe, not bullet holes or explosive damage, but rather places where the metal and concrete seemed to have flowed, like wax melting down a candle, except these patterns crawled upward, defying gravity. Morrison found the first body on the second floor, or rather what was left of it. The coalition uniform was intact but empty, laid out flat as if someone had simply stepped out of it, leaving everything, dog tags, equipment, even a wedding ring, in perfect position. Thompson knelt to examine it, his medical training warring with what his eyes were telling him. "Jack," he called me over, voice shaking. "Look at this." He pointed his torch at the uniform's collar. There, barely visible, was a handprint. Not burned or bloodied, the fabric and skin oils were intact, but the material had aged decades in the shape of those fingers, as if whatever touched it had somehow fast-forwarded time itself in the exact pattern of its grip. O'Brien's voice crackled over our short-range radio. "Sir, you need to see this. Lower level. We found their comm room." The stairs leading down felt wrong under our feet, each step vibrating with that same deep, bone-aching rhythm we'd heard outside. The comm room door was sealed, not locked, sealed, as if the metal had partially liquefied and reset. It took 3 of us to force it open. Inside, every piece of electronic equipment was dead, their screens shattered not outward, but inward, as if something had pulled the light itself out of them. But it was the walls that captured our attention. Every available surface was covered in writing, some in marker, some carved directly into the metal, some apparently scratched by fingernails. The same message over and over in dozens of languages. "They wear our dead. They speak with stolen voices. Don't trust what you see." And below that, a single line in fresh blood. "They already know you're here." That's when we heard the voices, our own voices, calling from outside. Morrison's head snapped up. "Nobody move," he ordered, but Jenkins was already turning toward the sound of his mother calling his name. The young sniper's face went white. "That's impossible," he whispered. "She's in Liverpool. She can't be." "Bobby," Morrison's voice cut through the darkness like a knife. "Those aren't our people. Nothing human made those sounds." The screaming started again, closer now. Not the inhuman shrieking from before, but perfect duplicates of human voices. I heard myself calling for help. Heard Morrison giving orders. Heard Thompson swearing in his thick Glasgow accent. All coming from different directions, all slightly out of sync, all wrong in ways that made my skin crawl. Through our remaining functional radio, we picked up fragments of Iraqi military communications. They were scrambled, panicked, describing something that had attacked their own forward positions. Multiple units all reporting the same thing: soldiers disappearing, equipment failing, and something that could perfectly mimic human voices stalking them through the darkness. Morrison made the call. "We're bugging out. Back to the main entrance, double time." But as we turned to leave, the comm room's broken screens flickered to life. Not with power, there was none, but with a pale, organic luminescence that cast everything in a sickly glow. In that light, we saw them. Not directly, never directly, but in the reflections on those dead screens. Shapes moving through the darkness behind us, wearing familiar faces, wearing our faces. O'Brien screamed first. Not in fear, but in rage. He opened fire, the muzzle flash strobing through the darkness. Something moved, fast, impossibly fast, and suddenly he was gone. Just gone, between one heartbeat and the next, his rifle clattering to the floor. Morrison grabbed me by the shoulder, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "Run." We ran, through corridors that stretched and twisted in ways they shouldn't have been able to, upstairs that felt like they were trying to pull us back down, past windows that showed different skies, different worlds. Behind us, O'Brien's voice called out for help, using words I'd heard him speak hours earlier. We burst out into the desert night, and for a moment, I thought we'd made it. The stars were wrong, a different pattern than they should have been, but at least it was open air. Then Bobby looked up, his young face filled with terror, and screamed a single word: "Move." Something vast and dark blotted out the stars above us. Something that moved like liquid shadow, that wore faces like masks, that reached down with limbs that shouldn't exist. Morrison's training took over. Scatter, different directions, now. We broke apart, each running blindly into the desert night. The thing above us, and I struggle even now to call it a thing, because that word implies boundaries, limits, a fixed shape, seemed to hesitate, as if confused by our dispersal. That hesitation saved our lives. I ran until my lungs burned, until the taste of copper filled my mouth. Behind me, I could hear footsteps, sometimes falling in rhythm with mine, sometimes running in impossible patterns, as if someone was sprinting in circles around me while keeping perfect pace beside me. The desert floor suddenly disappeared beneath my feet. I tumbled down a sandy slope, my rifle lost in the fall. When I finally stopped rolling, I found myself in some kind of depression in the earth. Above me, something moved across the stars. Not the huge shape from before, but smaller ones, like living shadows flowing over the sand. My training screamed at me to move, but something else, something older than military instinct, told me to stay perfectly still. I watched as those shapes flowed past my hiding place, wearing the faces of my squad mates, calling out in their voices. One stopped directly above me, and I saw my own face looking down, but wrong, like a reflection in troubled water, the features rippling and shifting. For 3 hours, I stayed in that hollow, barely breathing, as those things hunted. I heard gunfire in the distance, sharp cracks of rifle shots answered by sounds that no weapon made by human hands could produce. I heard voices calling for help, some belonging to my squad, others to people who couldn't possibly be there. At one point, I heard my daughter crying, impossible, since she wouldn't be born for another 5 years. Just before dawn, I heard Morrison's whistle, our emergency regroup signal. It came from the east, followed by 2 more signals from different directions. But then I heard a 4th whistle, and I knew we'd only had 3 whistles in the squad. I waited. Another hour passed before I heard Morrison's voice, low and harsh. "Jack, over here." I didn't move. "Smart lad." Morrison's real voice came from behind me, making me jump. He was pressed against the other side of the depression, his face streaked with blood and something black that wasn't blood. "Spot the difference." The other Morrison was still calling, its voice becoming increasingly distorted, like a tape playing at the wrong speed. "Thompson and Jenkins are about half a click east," Morrison whispered. "Something's happened to O'Brien. His body. We found his body, but it wasn't." He stopped, swallowing hard. I'd never seen him struggle for words before. "It wasn't empty," he finally said. "It was full of something else." The sun was rising, and with its light, the voices began to fade. We waited another 30 minutes before moving, making our way carefully east until we found Thompson and Jenkins huddled in the lee of a sand dune. Jenkins was shaking uncontrollably, his rifle clutched so tightly his knuckles were white. Thompson had a 1,000-yard stare I'd never seen on him before, not even after the worst combat situations. "We need shelter," Morrison said, studying the terrain. "Somewhere defensible. We can't be out in the open when night falls again." That's when Jenkins pointed at something emerging from the sand as the wind shifted. A metal hatch, its surface covered in markings that looked like a cross between Arabic script and something much, much older. "No," Thompson said immediately. "No bloody way we're going underground after what we just saw." Morrison checked his watch, one of the few pieces of equipment still functioning. "We've got about 10 hours until sunset. No way we make it back to friendly lines before dark. You want to take your chances up here." None of us did. What we'd seen in the observation post was horrible, but at least it was concentrated, contained. Out in the open, those things could come from anywhere, wear any face, speak with any voice. The hatch opened with surprising ease, revealing a set of stairs descending into darkness. The air that wafted up was cool and dry, carrying a faint scent of spices and age. Morrison took point, with Thompson behind him. I went next, and Jenkins brought up the rear, constantly looking back up at the increasingly distant square of daylight above. The stairs went down for what felt like forever, the walls around us changing from modern concrete to older stone blocks to something that looked almost grown rather than built. Our torchlight revealed carvings that seemed to shift when viewed directly, depicting scenes that made less sense the longer you looked at them. Finally, we reached a circular chamber with multiple corridors branching off like spokes on a wheel. The walls here were covered in more modern equipment, radio gear, monitoring stations, banks of computers, all dead like the equipment in the observation post. But underneath all that technology were more carvings, more of that strange script. Multiple exit routes, Morrison noted, his tactical mind still working despite everything we'd seen. Defensible position. We can set up here, try to raise someone on the radio. Maybe. He stopped as Thompson held up his hand. The medic was examining something on one of the walls, a series of photographs pinned up like a briefing board. They showed archaeological excavations, each dated a few months before the invasion of Kuwait. In the final photo, a group of Iraqi military officers stood around what looked like a stone tablet, their faces showing a mixture of fear and awe. "I can read some Arabic," Thompson said, squinting at the notes scribbled beneath the photos. "They found something down here, something old. They were trying to, bloody hell." "What?" Jenkins asked, his voice cracking. "Trying to what?" "Weaponize it," Thompson replied, "but I don't think they understood what they were dealing with. Look at these dates. The last entry was 3 months ago. They knew these things were here, knew what they could do. They thought they could control them." Morrison swore softly. That's what the observation post was monitoring. Not Iraqi troop movements, this facility. A sound echoed up one of the corridors, metal scraping against stone, followed by a soft, wet noise like something large breathing through multiple throats. Jenkins raised his rifle, its beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating more carvings. But these were different. These showed humanoid figures locked in combat with shapes that hurt the eyes to look at, shapes that seemed to move in the shifting torchlight. "Those aren't demons," Morrison said quietly, studying the carvings. "That's not religious iconography. These are records, warnings." The breathing sound came again, closer now, accompanied by a familiar voice, O'Brien's voice, speaking words in a language that made my ears bleed. The thing wearing O'Brien's voice got closer, its footsteps echoing oddly through the corridors, sometimes sounding like bootsteps, sometimes like something much heavier being dragged across stone. Morrison motioned us into defensive positions, using the dead computer banks as cover. That's when we heard another voice, this one human, scared, and speaking rapid-fire Arabic. Thompson spun toward the sound, then looked at Morrison. "Sir, that's a civilian." A figure burst into the chamber, wearing a torn lab coat and clutching a leather satchel. He saw us and froze, hands raising instantly. "American?" he asked in heavily accented English. "British." "British," Morrison answered, keeping his rifle trained on the man. "Who are you?" "Dr. Khalil Abbas," he replied quickly, eyes darting toward the corridor he'd emerged from. "Head of archaeological research. Please, they're coming. The ones who wear dead faces. They..." The lights in the chamber flickered, not our torches, but actual electric lights in the ceiling that shouldn't have had power. In that stuttering illumination, we saw something emerge from the corridor behind Dr. Abbas, something that wore O'Brien's face stretched across a head that was the wrong shape, too wide, too angular. Jenkins opened fire. The thing jerked as the rounds hit it, but instead of blood, its wounds leaked shadows that moved against the light. Dr. Abbas screamed and ran toward us. Morrison grabbed him and pulled him behind the makeshift barricade just as every light in the chamber exploded, showering us with sparks and glass. In the chaos, I heard Morrison shouting orders, heard Thompson swearing, heard Jenkins's rifle cycling through rounds. My own weapon barked in my hands, the muzzle flash providing strobing glimpses of what we were fighting. The thing had stopped pretending to be human. O'Brien's face split open like a rotten fruit, revealing something underneath that resembled a sculpture of smoke given solid form. Dr. Abbas was praying in Arabic, clutching his satchel. Thompson grabbed him. "What are they? You know what they are." "The Ancient Ones," Abbas gasped. "The ones who came before humans, before civilization. They sleep in the deep places, wake when blood soaks the earth. War calls to them, pain calls to them. He stopped, eyes going wide. "Listen." The gunfire had stopped, and in the sudden silence we could hear it. That same deep rhythmic pulsing we'd felt outside the observation post, but stronger now, reverberating through the stone around us. The thing that had attacked us was gone, retreated back into the darkness, but somehow that was worse, because now we could hear movement from all around us, from every corridor, getting closer. "The tablet," Abbas said, pulling in stone slab covered in inscriptions from his satchel, "found in the lower chambers. It tells their weakness. They feed on fear, on suffering, but they can be hurt. Fire, extreme heat, it disrupts their ability to maintain form." Morrison's tactical mind kicked into gear. "White phosphorus grenades. We've got 4 between us." He turned to Abbas. "What else? What are they doing here?" "The military, they found this place during construction of bunkers," Abbas explained quickly. "Found evidence of their existence. Thought they could be controlled, used as weapons. But you can't control them. They're not just creatures, they're living ideas, concepts given flesh. They wear our shapes, speak with our voices, but they're hollow inside, empty, hungry." The rhythm in the walls was getting stronger. Jenkins suddenly stiffened. "Can anyone else smell that?" I could. The same chemical burn odor from the observation post, but mixed with something else now. An older smell, like dust from ancient tombs and dried blood. "More coming," Morrison said grimly. "Multiple contacts. Doctor, is there another way out of here?" Abbas nodded frantically. "The lower levels. There's an emergency exit tunnel, leads to the surface about 2 kilometers east, but..." He hesitated. "But what?" "It takes us past the hibernation chamber, where they sleep, where they've always slept, waiting for war to wake them." The sounds of movement were getting closer. Thompson checked his medical kit, pulling out flares. "The phosphorus grenades might buy us time, but we'll need more than that." Morrison nodded. "Jack, check that monitoring equipment. Anything still functioning?" I moved to the dead computers, and that's when I noticed something odd. The screens were dark, but heat was radiating from them. Not residual warmth from when they'd been running, but actual heat, growing stronger by the second. I pressed my hand against one of the monitors and jerked it back. The metal was nearly hot enough to burn. "Sir," I called out, "something's happening to the equipment." Every piece of technology in the room was getting hotter. The air began to shimmer with waves of heat rising from the dead machines. Abbas's eyes widened in recognition. "They're coming through. They use heat distortion to move between spaces. The computers, the radio equipment, they're turning them into doorways." Morrison didn't hesitate. "Move, now. Everyone down that corridor. Doctor, lead the way." We ran as the chamber behind us filled with impossible sounds, metal screaming as it melted, stone cracking from sudden heat, and underneath it all, that terrible rhythm growing louder and louder. The beam from my torch showed more carvings on the walls as we ran, depicting scenes of ancient battles. But these weren't normal military engagements. The carvings showed people fighting their own reflections, their own shadows, while things that defied description lurked in the spaces between them. The corridor sloped downward, taking us deeper underground. The air got colder, but not in a natural way. This was the kind of cold that burns, that makes your lungs ache with each breath. Our torchlight seemed to dim, as if the darkness was becoming physically thicker, more resistant to illumination. Then Jenkins, who was bringing up the rear, shouted a warning. I looked back and saw them coming, not the solid shapes from before, but something worse. It was like the darkness itself was flowing down the corridor after us, wearing faces like ripples on black water. I saw O'Brien's face, saw faces from the observation post, saw my own face floating in that liquid shadow. Thompson raised his rifle, but Morrison stopped him. "Save your ammunition. We need to reach the exit." There, Abbas pointed ahead, the chamber entrance. We burst through a set of heavy metal doors into a vast, circular space that dropped away below us. A catwalk ran around the perimeter, and in the center, I'm going to stop here for a moment. What we saw in that chamber, what we learned about the true history of our world and what really lives in its dark places, that needs its own telling, and I need to gather myself before I describe it, because once you really understand what's down there, you can never unknow it, never unsee it, and they're still there, still waiting, still hungry. The chamber was enormous, its ceiling lost in darkness above us, its floor descending into depths that made my mind rebel at trying to calculate them. But it wasn't the size that stopped us dead in our tracks. It was what lined the walls. Pods, thousands of them, organic-looking structures that pulsed with a dim, internal light. They were arranged in spiral patterns that hurt your eyes to follow, creating shapes that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them. Each pod was roughly the size of a person, but their surfaces rippled and shifted like oil on water. "The hibernation chamber," Abbas whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and terror, "where they sleep between wars, between feedings." The pods nearest to us were empty, their surfaces torn open from the inside. But deeper in the chamber, others still pulse with that sickly light. And in those lights, we could see shapes moving, waiting, growing. "How many?" Morrison asked, his voice tight. Abbas shook his head. "Hundreds active now, thousands still dormant. They wake in cycles, you see. The first war, they all woke together and nearly consumed every living thing. But they learned, adapted. Now they wake slowly, carefully. Each conflict draws out a few more. Each war feeds them, makes them stronger." Thompson was studying the nearest empty pod, his medical training overwhelming his fear. "These aren't constructed," he said. "They're grown, like living tissue, but wrong. The cellular structure is visible to the naked eye, but it doesn't match anything I've ever seen." "Because it's not from Earth," Abbas said. "None of this is. The tablets we found, the oldest inscriptions, they tell of how these things came here, long before humans evolved. They seeded the planet with these chambers, these growth pods, and went to sleep, waiting for intelligent life to evolve, waiting for us to learn how to make war." A sound echoed through the chamber, not the liquid movement from before, but something solid, metal on metal, coming from the catwalk on the far side. "Multiple contacts," Morrison whispered, moving to flank us. "Jenkins, Thompson, cover R6, Jack, with me. Doctor, stay in the middle. Where's this exit you mentioned?" Abbas pointed to a doorway about 30 meters along the catwalk. "Through there, but we have to cross in front of the active pods." "Sir," Jenkins called out in warning. Movement behind us. The shapes that flowed through the doorway we'd entered were barely pretending to be human now. They flickered between forms, soldiers, civilians, faces from the observation post. But their movements were wrong, like watching film played backwards and sideways simultaneously. Morrison made the call. "White phosphorus, on my mark." "Doctor, you said extreme heat disrupts them. Let's test that theory. Everyone ready, now." 4 grenades arced through the air. The explosions filled the chamber with harsh, white light and burning particles. The effect on our pursuers was immediate and horrifying. Where the burning phosphorus touched them, their forms dissolved, revealing glimpses of what they really were. Geometric shapes that shouldn't be able to exist in 3 dimensions. Colors that had no names in any human language. They screamed, not with stolen human voices this time, but with their true voices. The sound made my nose bleed and my vision blur. Jenkins dropped to his knees, hands pressed against his ears. "Move." Morrison grabbed Jenkins, hauling him up. "That won't hold them long." We ran along the catwalk, our boots clanging on metal. Below us, the active pods began pulsing faster, their light growing stronger, shapes pressed against their surfaces from within, like hands pushing against a membrane, but the hands had too many fingers, and the fingers had too many joints. The exit was ahead of us, just another 20 meters, 15, 10. Then the catwalk shuddered, not from our movement, from something massive stirring below. The rhythm that had been pulsing through the walls changed, becoming faster, more urgent. The pod's light synchronized with it, creating strobing patterns that left after images burned into my vision. "They're waking up," Abbas moaned. "All of them. They're not supposed to wake together. Not again. Not like the first time." The whole chamber began to vibrate. Pieces of stone fell from above, splashing into the darkness below. The catwalk swayed dangerously, and from that darkness, something rose, something vast, something that had been sleeping far longer than the others. Looking at it directly was impossible. Your mind simply refused to process what your eyes were seeing. But in the reflections on the pod surfaces, I caught glimpses, a shape like a tower made of twisted mirrors, each surface reflecting a different version of reality. Faces swirled across its form, millions of faces from every era of human history, all screaming silently. Morrison didn't hesitate. Last phosphorus, everyone together. Our remaining grenades arced out over the void. The explosion seemed tiny against the vastness of the thing rising from below, but where the burning particles struck its surface, reality itself seemed to crack. Light bent in impossible ways. Gravity hiccuped. For a moment, I saw other chambers, other versions of ourselves, other wars being fought across time and space. The thing recoiled, releasing a sound that existed more in our minds than in our ears. The catwalk beneath us buckled. Abbas screamed as he lost his footing, the tablet falling from his satchel. I lunged for it instinctively, my fingers closing around the ancient stone just as the metal beneath us gave way completely. We fell, not far. There was another level of catwalk about 10 feet below, but the impact scattered us. The tablet in my hands was hot, vibrating with the same rhythm that filled the chamber, and as I looked at it, I realized I could read the inscriptions, not with my eyes, but with something else, something deeper. The knowledge flooded into my mind like ice water. They weren't just predators, they were gardeners. They seeded worlds with life, guided evolution, shaped species, not out of scientific curiosity or benevolence, but to cultivate food that could truly feed them. Physical sustenance meant nothing to them. They fed on fear, on pain, on the psychic energy generated by intelligent beings in conflict. And humanity, with our capacity for warfare, for cruelty, for inflicting suffering on our own kind. We were their perfect crop. "Jack," Morrison's voice snapped me back to reality. "Through that door, now." I scrambled up, still clutching the tablet. Jenkins and Thompson were already through the doorway. Abbas lay crumpled against a railing, his leg clearly broken. Morrison and I grabbed him, dragging him through as the chamber behind us filled with moving darkness. The tunnel beyond was narrow, sloping upward. Emergency lighting strips still functioned here, casting everything in dim red light. Behind us, the darkness pressed against some kind of invisible barrier in the doorway, not physical but metaphysical, inscribed with symbols that matched ones on the tablet I carried. "They can't follow immediately," Abbas gasped through his pain. "The wards, the ancient ones who opposed them, left protections." "Save your strength," Thompson said, examining his leg. "Clean break. I can splint it, but..." He was cut off by a sound from above. Automatic weapons fire, followed by shouts in Arabic. Morrison's expression hardened. Iraqi patrol. Must be guarding the exit. He checked his ammunition. Options. But before anyone could respond, the gunfire turned to screaming. Not surprise shouting or combat noise. The kind of screaming that comes when someone sees something their mind can't process. Then silence. Heavy silence. "They're learning," Abbas whispered. "The ones we woke. They're learning faster than before, adapting, evolving. They'll reach the surface soon, spread through the war zone, feeding on the conflict, growing stronger, and the more they feed." The walls around us shuddered. That burning chemical smell was back, seeping through the stone itself. The emergency lights began to pulse in rhythm with a sound that made my teeth feel like they were trying to crawl out of my gums. Morrison looked at each of us in turn, his face set in grim determination. "Doctor, how long will those wards hold?" "Minutes, no more." "Right." He checked his weapon one last time. "This is what we're going to do. Thompson, that medical kit, show me everything flammable, alcohol, disinfectant, anything that'll burn." Morrison's voice was steady, the same tone he'd use planning a routine patrol. "Jenkins, check the Iraqi bodies above. If you can reach them safely, get their weapons, grenades, anything useful. Jack, you and the doctor work on that tablet. I need to know everything about these wards, these protections, how they work, how we can use them." We moved with desperate efficiency. Thompson's kit yielded several bottles of pure alcohol and some magnesium strips from his emergency flares. Jenkins returned with 3 AK-47s, and more importantly, several grenades. Not white phosphorus, but better than nothing. Meanwhile, Abbas and I studied the tablet. The knowledge continued flowing into my mind, bringing with it headaches that felt like ice picks behind my eyes. The wards weren't just symbols, they were mathematical expressions of reality itself, equations written in a language that predated numbers. "The ancient ones," Abbas explained, his voice tight with pain from his broken leg. "They weren't gods or demons. They were like antibodies, the universe's immune system, fighting against these things that feed on suffering. They couldn't destroy them, but they could bind them, trap them in these chambers." The pounding through the walls was getting stronger. The emergency lights flickered, and in the darkness between flashes, I could see something seeping through the stone. Not liquid, but living shadows that moved with purpose. "How long would a binding last?" Morrison asked, rigging some kind of improvised device with the medical supplies and grenades. Abbas shook his head. "Hours maybe, but it would need to be powered by what? By life, by sacrifice. The wards need an anchor point, something to hold them in place." Morrison nodded, as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Right then, new plan. Thompson, take point. Get the doctor and Jenkins to the surface. Jack, you're their backup. Sir, I interrupted, finally understanding what he was planning. "No, there has to be another way." "There isn't. You've seen what these things can do. If they reach the surface, reach the war zone, they'll feed on every battle, every death, grow stronger, spread. And next time, they won't wait for war, they'll create it, manipulate us into fighting each other just to feed their hunger." The darkness seeping through the walls was taking shape now, forming into half-seen figures that flickered between human and something else. The air grew thick with that chemical burning smell, and the temperature dropped until our breath fogged in front of us. "Listen," Morrison continued, checking the improvised charges he'd created. "What we saw down there, that was just one chamber. There are others all over the world, anywhere there's been enough bloodshed to wake them. But this one we can stop, seal it up again." Thompson stepped forward. "Sir, let me—" "No arguments, Corporal. Get them out. That's an order." Morrison's voice softened slightly. "Someone needs to warn others, to be ready in case this doesn't work." The shadows were almost solid now, pressing against that invisible barrier. Through them, I could see faces. O'Brien's, the Iraqi soldiers from above, faces from every war ever fought, all screaming silently. Morrison took the tablet from my hands, studying the ancient symbols. "How do I activate them, Doctor?" Abbas explained quickly, his words tumbling over each other. The barrier at the doorway pulsed, weakening. A hand made of darkness reached through, not a human hand, but something with too many joints, too many angles. "Go," Morrison barked. "Now, before—" The barrier shattered. What happened next is still jumbled in my memory. I remember Thompson and Jenkins dragging Abbas toward the exit. Remember Morrison shouting words that made reality itself shiver. Remember the darkness surging forward, wearing 1,000 faces. Remember Morrison looking at me one last time, smiling that same calm smile he'd wear before any mission. "Been an honor," he said. Then he pulled the pins on his improvised charges. The explosion wasn't just light and sound, it was something else, something that rippled through dimensions we weren't meant to perceive. The wards on the tablet flared to life, burning with a light that wasn't light. And in that moment, I saw Morrison's face change, become something ancient and terrible and infinitely wise. One of them, one of the protectors who'd bound these things the first time. He'd known, somehow he'd known all along. The tunnel collapsed behind us as we ran. The last thing I heard before the rock sealed was Morrison's voice, not speaking any human language, but something older, something final. We reached the surface as the sun was rising. The Iraqi patrol's vehicles were there, empty, their radios crackling with confused voices asking for status reports. Thompson got a boss into one of the jeeps while Jenkins covered us. Looking back, I could see the ground subsiding, sinking into the space where that massive chamber had been, sinking, and then being filled with something that burned like magma, but wasn't magma. The Ancient Ones had left more than just wards. They left failsafes, ways to seal the chambers permanently if the price was paid. We drove east until we found coalition forces, made up some story about getting separated during a patrol, about Iraqi troops shooting at us, a standard debrief, a few questions that would get filed away and forgotten in the chaos of war. But I kept the tablet, kept studying it, learning. They're still out there, you see, still sleeping in their chambers beneath the earth. Morrison bought us time, sealed one nest, but there are others, and they're patient, so patient. They'll wait for the next war, the next outbreak of mass violence, wait for us to feed them again. That's why I'm breaking silence now. The satellite photos I mentioned at the start, they show construction plans. Someone's going to start digging in that region again, breaking ground, breaking seals. And if you're reading this, if you're one of the people planning to dig there, don't. Please, some things should stay buried, some doors should stay closed, because Morrison's sacrifice won't mean anything if we just open another chamber, just give them another chance to wake up, to feed. They're hungry again, I can feel it. In my dreams, I see their faces, all their faces, hear their voices, all their voices, and under it all, that rhythm, that pulse, like a heartbeat, like a drum, getting stronger, getting closer, getting hungry.